I felt my heart drop into my stomach the moment my husband started speaking Spanish to the realtor. Because he thought I didn't understand a single word. He smiled at me like everything was normal, like we were just another happy couple house, hunting on a sunny Saturday morning. But the second the realtor stepped closer, he switched languages and lowered his voice. "Ella no nada," he said casually. "She doesn't understand anything." The realtor nodded politely, and that's when my husband leaned in and said something that made my blood run cold. "Once the sale goes through, I'm putting the house only under my name. She thinks we're buying it together." My chest tightened so fast I had to grip the kitchen counter to steady myself. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of building a life, saving money, sacrificing vacations, skipping luxuries so we could finally afford a home. And he was planning to erase me from it. The realtor hesitated. "But she's on the paperwork you sent earlier." My husband chuckled. "That was just to get the loan approved faster. After closing, I'll fix it. She won't know the difference." I stood there quietly, staring at the marble countertop while my ears burned. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal. It was how confident he sounded. Like I was stupid. Like I was invisible. Like I had no idea what he was saying. The funny thing about that assumption. My grandmother raised me in a bilingual home. Spanish was the language of my childhood. I understood every single word. I just never mentioned it to him. At first it was harmless, a little surprise I thought I'd reveal someday. But standing in that kitchen, hearing my husband calmly plan to steal our house from me, I decided something else. I decided to stay quiet. For now, I smiled politely through the rest of the tour, nodding as if I understood nothing while they continued discussing their plan. Right in front of me. By the time we left the house, my husband looked pleased with himself. "Nice place, right?" he said in the car. "Yeah," I said softly. "It's perfect." And that's when my own plan started forming. The next few weeks were interesting. He kept making calls in Spanish when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Mostly to the realtor, sometimes to a lawyer friend of his. Every time, he repeated the same idea. Remove me from ownership after closing. Make sure everything stayed legally his. I let him talk. I let him think he was clever. Meanwhile, I quietly started making my own calls. First, I contacted the bank directly. Then the real estate attorney listed on the paperwork. And finally, the realtor herself. I scheduled a private meeting. When I sat down across from her, she looked nervous. "I didn't know you spoke Spanish," she admitted. "I do," I said calmly. Then I repeated word for word what my husband had said during the house tour. Her face went pale. "Legally," she explained, "that kind of change after closing would require both signatures." "Exactly," I said. "But that's not why I'm here." I slid a folder across the desk. Inside were financial statements, savings records, and proof of where the down payment was actually coming from. My account, my inheritance, my years of savings. 80% of the down payment was mine. The realtor flipped through the documents slowly. "What do you want to do?" she asked carefully. I smiled. "Nothing illegal," I said. "Just honest paperwork." Over the next few days, the contract was adjusted. Quietly, legally, carefully. Ownership would still be shared, but the financial structure changed. If the property was ever sold or divided, 80% of the equity would legally belong to me. And there was one more small addition. A clause protecting my investment in case of marital separation. The lawyer said it was perfectly reasonable, given the contribution difference. By the time closing day arrived, everything was finalized. My husband signed the documents quickly, barely reading them. He looked proud, almost smug. Probably imagining the moment he'd remove me later. When the agent handed us the final copies, he wrapped an arm around my shoulders. "Homeowners," he said happily. I smiled back. Homeowners. 3 months later, the truth finally came out. He sat me down one evening looking nervous. "There's something we should talk about," he said. I stayed quiet. "I've been thinking, since I'm the one managing the finances, it might make sense to adjust the ownership paperwork." My heart almost laughed. "Adjust how?" I asked calmly. "Well," he hesitated. "Put the house only under my name. Just for simplicity." I leaned back in my chair. Then I opened the drawer beside me and pulled out the official closing documents. "Before you do that," I said softly, sliding them across the table, "you should probably read page 17. He frowned and flipped through the pages. At first he looked confused. Then his eyes widened. Then his face turned completely white. He kept reading. And reading. Finally he looked up at me. You understand Spanish. he asked slowly. I met his gaze. I always have. The silence between us stretched thick and heavy. And the house, he asked. I smiled slightly. If we ever separate, I said calmly, 80% of the equity is legally mine. His mouth opened, but no words came out. I stood up, picked up my tea, and walked toward the living room. 10 years of marriage had taught me one important thing. Revenge isn't loud. It's quiet. Patient sometimes. It's written in the fine moment. My husband laughed and said in Spanish, "She has no idea what we're saying." Something inside me went completely still. Not angry. Not shocked. Just still. Because I understood every word. We were sitting at a small cafe across the street from a house we had just toured with a realtor. It was supposed to be a happy moment, 10 years of marriage, finally leading to our first real home. But as soon as the realtor stepped away to answer a phone call, my husband leaned back in his chair and spoke quietly in Spanish. "Once we close the deal," he said, "I'll transfer the title so it's only under my name." My stomach dropped. She won't question it. She doesn't even understand Spanish. The realtor returned and sat down slowly, clearly uncomfortable. "But the paperwork shows both of you as buyers," she said carefully. My husband waved his hand dismissively. "That's temporary. It just helps with approval. After closing, I'll correct it. Like I was some clerical error." I stared down at my coffee, my hands trembling just enough that I had to tighten my grip on the cup. 10 years. 10 years of shared bills, shared dreams, shared sacrifices. And this man was planning to quietly erase me. What he didn't know was that Spanish was the language my grandmother used when she wanted to tell me secrets my parents wouldn't understand. I grew up speaking it, understanding it, living in it. I just never mentioned it to him. And in that moment, I realized silence was going to be my greatest advantage. So I did nothing. I smiled when they looked at me, nodded politely, pretended to be bored by a conversation I supposedly couldn't follow. Meanwhile, they continued discussing their little plan right in front of me. When we left the cafe, my husband looked energized. "Exciting day," he said. "Yeah," I replied quietly, "very exciting." That night I didn't confront him. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I opened my laptop. The first thing I did was look through every financial record connected to the house purchase. Savings, transfers, down payment, closing costs. The numbers told a very interesting story. Out of the entire down payment, almost 70% came from my account. My inheritance from my grandmother, the same grandmother who taught me Spanish. The irony almost made me smile. The next morning, while my husband was at work, I made a phone call to the realtor. She sounded nervous when she realized it was me. "I think we should talk privately," I said. We met at her office that afternoon. The moment I sat down, I spoke to her in Spanish. Her eyes widened immediately. You understood everything?" she asked. "Every word." I repeated exactly what my husband had said at the cafe. She rubbed her temples slowly. "I thought something felt wrong," she admitted. Then I showed her the financial breakdown. My contribution. His contribution. The reality behind our shared purchase. She flipped through the papers carefully. "This changes things," she said. "Not illegally," I replied calmly, "just accurately." Within a few days, a small but important adjustment was added to the ownership agreement. Nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious. Just a clause acknowledging financial contribution percentages. If the property was ever sold or divided, profits would be distributed based on the original investment. 70% to me, 30% to him. Perfectly legal, perfectly fair. And buried deep enough in the paperwork that someone who skimmed documents would never notice. Closing day came quickly. My husband was cheerful the entire morning. He shook the realtor's hand, joked with the lawyer, and signed every document without reading more than a few lines. I watched him carefully. Not with anger, just curiosity. He had no idea the trap he thought he set had quietly reversed itself. When everything was finished, he pulled me into a hug. "We did it," he said proudly. "Yes," I replied softly. "We did." 3 months later, he finally tried to make his move. It happened during dinner. He cleared his throat and leaned forward. "So, I've been thinking about something regarding the house paperwork." I took a sip of water and waited. "Well," he said slowly, "since I manage most of the finances, it might make sense to simplify ownership." "Simplify?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Move the title fully into my name." There it was. The moment he'd been planning since that cafe conversation. I stood up quietly and walked to the hallway drawer. Inside was a folder. The same folder I had kept since closing day. I placed it gently on the table in front of him. You should probably read section 8, I said. He frowned and flipped through the pages. At first he looked confused. Then his eyebrows pulled together. Then his entire face drained of color. What is this? He asked. Contribution agreement, I said calmly. He kept reading. The percentages. The equity distribution. The clause protecting my financial investment. His hand started shaking slightly. You knew? He asked quietly. I knew. And you speak Spanish? He asked. I always have. The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crack the walls. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the paperwork like it had betrayed him. But the truth was simple. He hadn't been betrayed. He had simply been heard. I stood up and began clearing the dishes from the table. As I walked past him, I paused for a moment. You were right about one thing, I said softly. He looked up slowly. I didn't say anything. I continued. Because sometimes the smartest revenge is letting someone finish their plan. Then I carried the plates into the kitchen, leaving him alone at the table with the fine print that now protected everything. He tried to almost drop the grocery bag when I heard my husband laugh in Spanish and say, "Relax. She doesn't understand a word." The realtor chuckled nervously. I froze in the hallway, hidden just around the corner of our kitchen wall. She thinks the house is for us. My husband continued calmly. But after closing, I'll transfer everything into my name. My fingers tightened around the plastic bag so hard it started to tear. Are you sure that's legal? The realtor asked carefully. My husband shrugged. She won't even know. She trusts me. Trusts me. 10 years of marriage. 10 years of believing we were building a future together. And apparently, I was just a convenient co-signer. The funny thing was, the only person in that room who didn't know the truth was him. Spanish was my first language. My father worked in Mexico for years when I was a kid. I went to school there, made friends there, lived half my childhood speaking Spanish. But when I met my husband, it just never came up. At first it didn't matter. And later, I guess I just liked having one thing that was mine. Standing there behind that wall, listening to him calmly plan to steal our house, I realized something. Silence was about to become my greatest weapon. So I walked into the kitchen like nothing had happened. Hey, I said, smiling politely. Both of them jumped slightly. My husband recovered quickly. Oh, perfect timing, he said. We were just talking about the closing paperwork. I nodded and set the groceries down. Sounds important. The realtor looked at me with a strange expression, almost guilty. But she stayed quiet. Over the next few weeks, my husband made several more calls in Spanish. He was very confident, very relaxed, very sure he was the smartest person in the room. And every time he talked about his plan, I listened carefully, piece by piece, detail by detail, until I understood exactly what he intended to do. Then I quietly started making my own moves. First, I contacted the real estate attorney listed on our purchase documents. I asked for a private consultation. When I arrived, he greeted me politely and started explaining the standard ownership structure. Half and half, joint title, normal married purchase. I stopped him. Before we continue, I said calmly, I should tell you something. Then I repeated the exact conversation my husband had with the realtor. In Spanish, word for word. The attorney leaned back slowly. That changes things, he said. I slid a folder across his desk. Inside were bank statements, transfer records, and proof of where the majority of the down payment had come from. My savings. My inheritance. Nearly 75% of the purchase funds. The attorney studied the documents carefully. Well, he said after a moment, if your financial contribution is that high, we can structure the ownership agreement differently. Legally. Completely. Over the next week, the paperwork was adjusted. Not dramatically, just enough. Ownership percentages based on financial contribution. Protection clauses if the property was sold. And one additional clause that made the attorney raise an eyebrow. If one party attempts to transfer ownership without the other's consent, he explained, the equity distribution will immediately default to contribution percentages. 75% to me, 25% to him. The beauty of it was simple. The documents looked standard. Nothing flashy, nothing obvious. But legally everything had changed. Closing day came faster than expected. My husband looked incredibly proud of himself. He signed every page with barely a glance. I watched his pen move across the paper again and again. Signature, signature, signature. Each one locking his own plan into a trap he didn't even see. When the closing finished, he hugged me tightly. We're finally homeowners, he said happily. I smiled. Yes. 3 months later, his moment arrived. We were sitting in the living room when he cleared his throat. So, I've been reviewing the house documents, he said carefully. I kept scrolling on my phone. Oh. Yeah, he continued. I think we should simplify things. Put the property fully under my name for tax reasons. I slowly looked up. For tax reasons. He nodded confidently. Exactly. I stood up, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled out the blue folder containing the final signed documents. Then I placed it in his hands. You should read page 19, I said. He frowned but opened it. At first his expression was confused. Then he leaned closer. Then he flipped back a few pages. Then forward again, his face slowly turned pale. What is this? He whispered. Ownership distribution. I replied calmly. He looked up at me, eyes wide. You knew. I knew. You understand Spanish? I always did. The silence that followed felt thick and heavy. He stared down at the contract again like the words might change if he blinked. They can't do this, he said weakly. They already did. But I signed. Yes, I said gently. You signed everything. His shoulders slumped. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked small, defeated. Not because I yelled, not because I exposed him, but because the plan he thought was so clever had quietly folded in on itself. I picked up my book from the coffee table and walked toward the hallway. Just before leaving the room, I paused. You were right about one thing, I said softly. He looked up slowly. I didn't understand the conversation. His expression flickered with confusion. Then I finished the sentence. Until I heard it. And sometimes, hearing the truth is all someone needs to change the ending of the story. The moment my husband said in Spanish, "Don't worry, she doesn't understand anything," my entire world shifted. We were standing in the living room of a house we were about to buy. Sunlight poured through the big windows, and the realtor was explaining the details of the closing process. I smiled politely, pretending to scroll through my phone. But my ears were locked on every word. My husband leaned closer to the realtor and lowered his voice. After closing, he said in Spanish, "I'll move the title to my name only. She thinks we're buying it together, but it's better this way." The realtor looked uncomfortable. "But the loan documents list both of you?" she replied. My husband laughed softly. "She won't question it. She trusts me." My chest tightened so hard it felt like the air had disappeared from the room. Trust. 10 years of marriage reduced to a convenient weakness. The worst part wasn't even the plan. It was the confidence. The certainty that I was too clueless to ever find out. What he didn't know was that my mother was from Colombia. Spanish was the language of my childhood dinners, family stories, and bedtime conversations. I understood everything. And right then, I decided to say nothing. Not yet. Instead, I slipped my phone back into my purse and walked over with a smile. "What are you two whispering about?" I joked. My husband instantly switched to English. "Oh, just boring paperwork stuff." The realtor glanced at me for half a second too long. She knew. But she stayed quiet, and so did I. That night, while my husband slept, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open. I reviewed every financial detail tied to the house purchase. The numbers told a story he clearly hadn't paid attention to. The down payment, the closing costs, the initial deposit. Nearly 80% of the money came from my account, my savings, my inheritance from my mother, my 10 years of careful budgeting. If he wanted to play games with paperwork, I could play too. Only I would play it better. The next morning, I called the realtor and asked if we could meet privately. She sounded nervous but agreed. When I sat across from her in her office, I didn't waste time. I switched to Spanish immediately. Her eyes widened. "You understood everything?" she said. "Yes." Then I calmly repeated my husband's exact words from the house tour. The room fell silent. Finally, she sighed. I had a feeling something wasn't right. I placed a folder of bank statements on her desk. "My contribution to the purchase," I said. She flipped through the pages slowly. "This is a huge difference." "Exactly." She leaned back in her chair. "What do you want to do?" I thought about that question for a long moment. "I don't want drama," I said finally. "I just want accuracy." Within a few days, the purchase agreement was quietly adjusted. Not in a way that would raise suspicion, but in a way that reflected financial truth. Ownership percentages based on contribution. 80% mine, 20% his. There was also a small protective clause. If one party ever attempted to transfer ownership without mutual consent, the other would automatically retain their full equity share. Perfectly legal. Perfectly fair. and buried deep enough in the documents that someone rushing through closing would never notice. Closing day arrived a week later. My husband was in a fantastic mood. He joked with the lawyer, shook the realtor's hand, and signed document after document without reading more than a few lines. I watched carefully as his signature appeared again and again, each one quietly sealing his own mistake. When it was over, he wrapped his arm around my shoulders. "We did it," he said proudly. "Our house." I smiled back. "Our house." 3 months passed peacefully. Then one evening, during dinner, he cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about the house paperwork," he said. I kept eating. "Oh, yeah," he continued. "Since I'm handling most of the financial planning, it might be easier if the property was under my name alone." I slowly set my fork down. "That sounds like a big change." "It's just paperwork," he said casually. I stood up and walked to the cabinet where I kept an organized stack of important documents. From the back, I pulled out a thick folder. Then I placed it on the table in front of him. "You should read section 12, I said calmly. He frowned but opened the file. At first he looked confused. Then he flipped a few pages. Then he leaned closer. The color slowly drained from his face. "What is this?" he whispered. "Ownership distribution," I replied. He kept reading. 80%, 20%. Legal protection clauses. His hands began to tremble slightly. "You knew?" he asked quietly. I knew. His eyes met mine. "You understand Spanish." "I always have." The silence between us stretched so long it felt almost physical. He looked down at the contract again like it had betrayed him. But the truth was much simpler. He had betrayed himself. I stood up and began clearing the dishes. As I carried the plates toward the kitchen, I paused beside the table. "You were right about something," I said softly. He looked up slowly. I didn't say anything. His brow furrowed in confusion. Then I finished the sentence. "Because sometimes the smartest revenge is letting someone sign their